In this video, I will demonstrate how the methods and properties of the official document object model can be used to create a very common JavaScript application. So here we see an FAQ scenario, and we have these questions and plus signs to the left of them. The plus signs are coded in as background images. When the user clicks the plus, we see more information. The plus sign changes to a minus. When I click the minus, the information disappears, the plus sign changes back. I can expand and collapse everything. So the ability to expand and collapse content is very common and very useful on the internet. Let's look at the HTML code. In the body section, we have a main element with an ID equals FAQS. The purpose for that ID is so that we can uniquely reference all of the code inside that container. We only want this effect to happen to this content, not content elsewhere. Each one of the questions is coded inside an H2 element, and the text is wrapped with an A element to make it clickable. Notice that the value of href is set to the hashtag, meaning that it will not go anywhere. So we have an H2, which is the question. Underneath the H2, we have a div, which is essentially the answer. Now, it doesn't matter what is inside the div, because we are working with the div itself. So we have three questions. We have an H2 and div. These are two siblings. An H2 and div, two siblings, an H2 and div. So here on the right, we have the application, and on the left, we have the code. So the user will be clicking on the question, which is the H2, and the div underneath the H2 will be displayed. Notice the icon will change also. All of the action is happening when the user clicks on the H2. Notice that there are no IDs or classes anywhere. We are accessing everything using the parent-child-sibling relationship. Because JavaScript works directly with CSS in order to change the page layout, it is very important to understand what is going on with your CSS. Here we have some styles applied to the H2. Remember, all of the action is happening when the user clicks on the H2. Here we have the background image. That is the plus sign that by default will be displayed when the page loads for every H2 element. Now, underneath in our CSS, we have an H2.minus. We have a class called minus being directly applied to the H2. Notice the background image is different. This class will be applied to the H2 using JavaScript. So when the user clicks the H2, not only do we see what's underneath, but our background image changes. I would like to point out one thing. We are not removing the plus. We are adding the minus. And what will happen, the minus will take precedence because we have a conflict. We are setting the background URL, the background image twice, so one is competing for the other. So in this case, the minus will be displayed. When the page loads, the content underneath each H2, which is a div container, is hidden. Here we see the CSS. Display none. We are setting the CSS property as the page loads. Now we also have an open class being defined for this div. And here we are setting the display property to block. This class will be applied using JavaScript. So what is happening when the user clicks on the H2? We are changing the value of the display property by adding that class called open. All of this is done using JavaScript. In our onLoad section, when the page loads, He is grabbing this ID and storing it in a variable so that we can easily reference all of the H2 elements using getElementsByTagName. Because we have more than one tag, our collection of H2 elements constitutes an array. So we are storing our H2 elements in this variable, which essentially is holding an array value. Because it is an array, we can loop through all of the H2 elements. Because it is an array, we have a length property, and we can start at 0 index. So what we are doing, we are looping through the 3 H2 elements, and for every instance, we are setting up an event handler. So in the event that that H2 is clicked on, it will call the toggle function. So when the user clicks on the H2, we will call the toggle function. And the author is merely initializing the focus to the first H2 element when the page loads. So here is our toggle function. The first thing you need to do is to determine which H2 is being clicked on, because there are 3 of them. So we use the JavaScript this keyword, and that is stored in the variable H2. Now we are using the next element sibling to reference the div that is the next element sibling of the current H2 that is being clicked. So rather than executing the code when every H2 is clicked, which is what would happen because there are 3 of them, we use the this keyword, which isolates the individual one that is being clicked on at that time. We have one if statement that essentially toggles the plus and minus. We have another if statement that essentially toggles the display property. So here we have if h2.hasAttribute class. This is the hasAttribute method, and it takes a value. Now when the page loads, the h2 does not have a class. So this statement would return false, and the else would execute. In that case, we are setting the attribute class to minus. So when the page loads, we have a plus sign, and when the user clicks on the H2, we are setting the class of minus, which will give us the minus sign. Now, when the user clicks on that same H2 a second time, we will read this if h2.hasAttribute class, in this case, it returns true. And in that case, we are removing it. So this is essentially a toggle. It's saying if it's not there, put it there. If it is there, take it away. And this is how we show and hide that minus sign. We're doing the same thing for the visibility of the div. When the page loads, the div has the display property set to none. There was also a class called open, which set the display property to block. So when the user clicks on the H2, we are also reading this second if div.hasAttribute class, and the first time it is clicked on, it does not have a class. So this if statement returns false, and the else is executed. In that case, we are setting the class attribute to open. When we click on it again, it reads the if, and it says if hasAttribute class, and in this case it does, then we remove the attribute. So every time you click on the H2, this toggle function is executed. It determines which H2 is being clicked on. It checks to see if their class exists in the H2 element, which controls the plus minus sign. It checks to see if a class exists in the next element sibling, which is the div, which controls the display property. One very useful way of seeing exactly what is happening is by using your developer tools in the browser. If I use the F12 key and I go to Elements, I can see what I have here. So here's an H2, there's a div, here's my H2 for my first question, there's a div, there's my H2 for my second question, and there's a div. There's the H2 for my third question. The minute I click on my plus sign, you can see, you also saw a little bit of a flash there. Notice we see class equals minus, class equals open. So when we clicked on that H2, 2 things happened. We manipulated, we added class equals minus, and we added class equals open using JavaScript. And we did that purely by accessing the elements, get elements by tag name, and the next element sibling. We did not put an ID anywhere in this page. So if I click on the next H2, there we see the classes are added. If I click again on my first question, notice those classes are removed. I click again, they're added. I click again, they're removed. When you manipulate the web page and the CSS using JavaScript, it will be visible in the Elements tab in the Inspect tool for the browser. So it is very useful to take advantage of this to actually see what is happening with your code.